All right, welcome everybody. Welcome to everybody around the world. I was gonna make a long video and talk about my years of research on the topic of giants, like 20 plus years. But I figured instead of doing that and mentioning the story when I was in Japan that one time and saw a group of actual giants, I thought why not just make a little separate video for that story. So behind me is my doorway, yes, and you can see these markers here, right? So basically, my room, I've never measured the height of my room. It's probably 10 feet or more, right? But that first little marker right here above my finger is 6 feet. Okay. I'm just under 6 feet. Okay. So that's 6 feet right there. The second marker is 7 feet. Okay. And then I'm imagining I can't reach it, but this white line's probably 8 feet, and that's probably the final two to make 10, right? So just as a little guide, right? I'll illustrate something in a moment. But so for starters, where I live, there are a few people who are in the 7 foot range, and I've walked by them. I've never met them personally, but I've walked by them in stores and stuff like that, and they tower over you. And these individuals don't have that condition that a lot of people that tall get, where it's almost like their bones and their internal organs and their arteries and everything are kind of like stretched out because it's like a pituitary growth issue or something, right? They're almost being made like too tall. You do have some people which are like natural giants. I don't know what the right term for it is, where they're like proportioned, but they're still 7 or 8 feet tall. And in basketball, for example, there's a lot of people, most of them, well, a lot of basketball players who are in the 7 foot range. Um, I think a lot of them have that condition where they're kind of, like, I don't know what the term for it is. And that's why, unfortunately, a lot of basketball players and people with that condition, they die young from like cardiac arrest and stuff because their internal organs it's just not, you know, it's not right. You know what I mean? So they suffer because of that. Shaquille O'Neal, I think, is just like more of a natural giant, and I don't know his actual height, but he's probably around 7.5 feet tall. So just for perspective, right? Shaquille O'Neal would be between this green mark here and that white, so that would be about 7.5 feet in between, right? So I'm just under this first green mark here, right? So when I walk by 7 foot something tall people in my life, yeah, they tower over me. But for perspective, my head is usually at their shoulder level. So they're really only about a head, maybe a head and a neck taller than me. So I've walked by people that tall. Okay. Now, there was a time when I was in Japan, however, I was flying through Japan getting a connecting flight. So I got to spend like 4 or something hours in Japan. Our flight actually got canceled because I might as well mention this as well. I'm sitting there waiting to go on the plane. It's due to arrive. The plane arrives, but they said there was something that fell apart or broke in the engine, and that if it was to take off, it would, you know, be the end. So they're like, nope, you can't fly on that plane. So they had to work on it. We had to wait for the next flight. So I'm sitting there walking around and everything, and it was this big, amazing, futuristic Japanese mall, and it's very interesting over there. They had amazing origami displays. I mean, the most mind blowing origami. You couldn't even imagine how incredible it is, right? And so I was just having a lot of fun walking around, taking in all the experience. And then at one point, a group of these giant men came past me. And I was thinking about it today. I was like, how old do I think they might be, right? So I don't think they're, between 15 to 25. Like they didn't have that youthfulness to them. At youngest, I would say late 20s, probably 30s or 40s. I don't recall them having like gray hair, like they look like, older. So I would say probably 30s or 40s. That was their approximate age, I would say. But a group of them, I would say probably at least six. I didn't sit there and count them, but there's a little group of them that came out. But these were the biggest people that I've ever seen in my life. And I literally was right there and they walked past me, like within feet. And when they went past me, they were so tall, they towered over me like Goliaths. And I had that direct firsthand experience. So they were well dressed, they had like suits on and stuff, but they were all about the same height. And all the years that have transpired since I had that trip and I had that experience, I'm sitting there thinking, were they a basketball team from Japan or from China? They looked, you know what I mean, like Japanese or Chinese, um, maybe Korean or something like that. But, from that side of the world, from any of those countries, they had that type of look. I'm just trying to find the right words to say and not offend anybody, right? Um, but they looked like that, right? They looked like they could be Japanese or Chinese. Let's just keep it like that. And none of them had a walking disability. Like they were perfectly fit, healthy, normal people. They were just massive. Okay, so remember, I'm used to seeing some people 7.5 feet tall. Okay, and at most, they're only like for guidance. If I'm basically around the height of that first mark, a 7 foot tall person's here, right? That's only like a head, maybe a head and a neck taller, right? Usually a head is just under a foot anyway, so it's really just a head taller. Shaquille O'Neal would be like a head and a neck taller than me, right? So if you stand next to somebody who's 7.5, if I stand next to somebody 7.5 feet tall, like the top of my head is like here, right? Is like right there. So my eyes would be looking at like this. Shaquille O'Neal, I might be looking a little bit lower down, but not that much more. So it's not that much taller than me. But I can tell you this: when these people, this group of giant men, walked by me, they walked down a little. I saw them walking in this area that I was in. They walked right down this little tiny flight of a few steps to this open area that I was right at, and they walked right past me, like the whole group of them. And as they walked past me, I'm sitting there looking up at them, like looking up at them. And I swear to God, right? I didn't have a tape measure, okay? But when they went past me, and I'm not exaggerating, my head, okay, was like down here, like at their gut. My head, okay, there is like half a foot between your eyes and the top of your head, roughly, right? But like generally, my head was towards their midsection. That's how tall they were. Okay. So if we're using this as a guide, right? So the other thing is your hand span is your height, right? So from my center to the end of my hand should be about 3 feet because I'm about 6 feet tall, right? So, anyways, I thought it'd be easier to work like. But you get the point, right? Sorry for my armpit here. That's pretty tall. Like if you were to see this, right, plus another hand, that would be a 9 foot person. That would be 50% of my height added on. That would be about 9 feet. So if we look at this here, that's 6, that's 7, that would be 8. So a 9 foot tall person would be about up here, right? Now 3 feet would take me to about my midsection. So what I'm thinking is that these guys that walk past me, so if you just try to imagine it, like my head is right here. That's the top of my head, right? Most basketball players would be like around here or just over. They're just like a head and a neck taller. My head was at these giants' midsection, right? So my head, this is like their stomach area. Okay, so you have their torso probably came up to here, shoulders, neck, and head. And it sounds far-fetched, but these guys had to be at least 8.5 feet tall. They had to be, because this white line is 8 feet. They had to be at least 8.5, potentially 9 feet tall. I've always figured they're probably in that range, 8.5 to 9.5 feet tall. It sounds fantastic, but I saw it. And these guys did not have any walking disability. They're perfectly normal, and they just walked by right in front of me. Like I could reach out and touch them. Okay. And as they went by, I couldn't see their heads, right? I just had to look up. I was like, well, I was in awe. Like I've actually experienced it, and it was a group of them, right? So I don't know if they were basketball players, but the other thing is this: the interesting thing about the eastern side of the world like that is there's such huge countries. Like China is massive. Even Japan's pretty big in its own respect, but China is immense, and all those other countries over there, especially Siberia and stuff, right? And native Russians and native Siberians look Chinese and like they're from Eastern Asia and all that as well, obviously, right? So, but there's so much land out there, so many little villages and towns and cities, and some of them might be more disconnected from the rest of the world and more isolated, right? It's very possible that maybe these guys were just from a village where they're all huge, right? It's very possible. It's either that or it's a basketball team. But if it's a basketball team, that was like the whole team are like 8 footers. Like I doubt they were under 8 feet. They had to be out of the 7 foot range. They had to be at least 8.5 feet tall. And I've never heard of a basketball team, I could be wrong, that is entirely made up of people 8.5 feet tall minimum. I don't think that exists. So they were well dressed in suits. And remember at the time thinking, my first impression was, oh, it's a Japanese business team, but they're giants. And I was just like, what in the world is going on here, right? But what business, like try to think, like just the logics here. There isn't like a business or a company in China and Japan that just hires giants, exceptionally tall people. Like, I don't think so. So I'm just saying at the end of the day, either it is some unheard of, super rare, super tall basketball team, or they're just like locals from a village of super tall people that don't get talked about in the Western world, right? And like if you look at Guinness World Records and this and that, there, the tallest people in the world that are alive today are between 7.5 and 8 feet tall. And when you're in that range, you usually require crutches and you have walking distance. Even if you can walk, you can't walk properly, right? And trying to be polite in how I describe it, you can almost tell that they have this gigantism because the way their features look, like you could just tell it's like these hormones for growth being pumped out because they'll have like very powerful jaws, deep. Well, that's the other thing, right? When you're that tall, the voices, I can't remember exactly what they sounded like, but they were talking. But let me tell you something, right? When something is that big, and I don't mean to disrespect them by calling them something, right? But when you're that big, when something is that big and it talks, the voice is extremely loud and deep because their throats, right? Probably like this wide, right? Their voice boxes are probably twice the size of mine. So when they talk, it's like from the movies. But nonetheless, I can't remember exactly what they sound like, but they were all chatting and talking and smiling to each other as they went by me. And it's just like, I felt like I was in some sci-fi movie. It didn't make any sense, but it was dead real. Um, so, anyways, I just think they're probably from a village of extremely tall people, and when you have all the, not everybody in the world who's super tall is just gonna be like, hey, Guinness World Records, like I want to be in your book. I want to be all in the Western media. I want the whole world to see me and talk about me and point their fingers at me. People who are exceptionally tall or have different features or whatever may not want to be known and heard and seen. So it's the Western world thinks, oh, if it's not on YouTube or if it's not on the Guinness Book of World Records, I'm not going to believe it. That's like the Western mindset, but that's a bit ridiculous, right? Could very well, there are, because I've seen them, right? There are super tall people, Goliath size, like literally that was the size of Goliath in the Bible. Okay, Goliath was nine foot tall or so. That's how big these people were. It's just mind blowing. They weren't big and muscular though. I forgot to mention that earlier. They weren't like big, powerful, muscular, burly, like built like Vikings or anything like that. There, but they didn't look. They just looked like average, normal build type people. It didn't look like they were bodybuilders and they worked out or they're all pumped up with super muscle. You know what I mean? But they just looked like normal, average people, but just almost twice as tall as me. Um, Whatever the mass would be, but like almost twice as tall as me. They didn't look like anorexic or very skinny or like they had any type of physiological condition. They didn't have any disability walking. You know what I mean? They just looked like normal people, but exceptionally tall. That's what I'm saying. So they really do exist. So that's my little story. Pretty cool. I wish I got a picture of them, but I think I was probably thinking at the time, I don't know who these people are. Maybe they're 9 foot tall alien humans that came visit Earth or something to go check out embassy in Japan. I'm just joking. But at the time, I was probably thinking, now I'm not going to pull my camera out and take a picture because what if they chase me? I'm not going to be able to run away from them. They're probably just going to go like blump, 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 and cover like 50 feet in 3 strides. So, anyways, that's a cool story, and I'm glad I got to experience it. But whoever they are is very, very interesting. But anyways, if anybody does know about a team of 8 foot tall plus basketball players from the East, let me know. Otherwise, I definitely did see a bunch of giants from civilization, and I'll just end on this note too. Like if well, people like that do exist because I saw them, right? But if you just think like back in the day, like in ancient times, hundreds or even thousands of years ago, if you had people that tall, like 8, 9 feet tall, they would be like, and I don't like these terms, I think they're ridiculous, but for lack of a better term, they would be like the alpha males. They would be sought after, right? Especially if of the, if they didn't have some type of condition and they were just naturally that tall, they would be like highly sought after, and there would be a lot of them, if you know what I mean, right? They would get married and have children and all that, you know what I mean? So they would have a lot of children, and so there probably were, by all logical reasoning, a lot of these super tall people, aka giants, on the planet. And a lot of people on the earth are still pygmies or very short. They're 4 feet to 5 feet. There's a lot of people like that, who are still alive today. Um, Even Europeans and others who are between 5 and 6 feet tall, they were a lot shorter back in the day. Like door frames in Europe, going back a couple hundred years, were like really short. They're like 5 feet tall. And nowadays, if you're of average height, you have to duck under them, right? So generalizing it, people were shorter hundreds of years ago or thousands of years ago. So if you had people 8, 9 feet tall walking around, they would look like they're twice your height. And it would be very, very intimidating. And especially if these alpha males, the super tall ones, were successful in getting wives and, procreating their families, and, getting lots and lots of them and having little groups or little tribes or little towns of them. Imagine yourself in the shoes of somebody who lived 1,000 years ago, and you're taking your little journey across the landscape with your donkeys, and you come upon this city, and the guys come out to greet you. You see the houses are all twice as tall, the doorways are twice as tall, the walls are twice as tall and thick, and then the people come out to greet you, and they look like they're twice as tall as you. Now, if they're friendly, then that's okay, but if they're not friendly, then you get all the legends of giants throughout the ages, right? And it all makes perfect sense. So, and they could have originated from one region on the earth and then spread out. You know what I mean? Or maybe it was just a characteristic that you would get throughout the world. There could have been super tall people on all the continents and all the different gatherings of mankind. But in either case, however it happened, they're definitely real. So I think all those, old day stories about town giants, like up in Europe, like every European country and town basically has town giants and tales of giants that used to either be friendly and help the town or be negative and used to like ransack the town all the time. Those legends are everywhere, and they're in the North Americas, very similar. All throughout Asia, it's very similar. Oceanic islands, it's similar. Australia, it's similar. Africa, it's similar. India, everywhere across the world, it's the same thing. And it's not that ancient peoples were just making all these things up for bedtime stories for kids or campfire stories. These were very, very real events. So giants probably just weren't like today. We have people who have dwarfism and such, right? And like science today says that giants, like true natural giants, don't exist. The most you get are people 7 or 8 feet tall, maybe a few Robert Wadlows, but they have that condition, right? So they're going to die young, unfortunately. And, you wouldn't, and science always tries to argue against, blah, blah, blah. But there's plenty of historical photos of natural giants who are 7 foot something. Shaquille O'Neal, others throughout Europe. There's lots of old antique photos of people 7.5 feet, maybe towards 8 feet, who are natural and muscular and properly built. And they had no problems walking around or living a long, healthy, happy life. So, but science always wants to, shoo away and poo poo away the concept of taller people. And they have all their excuses why it couldn't happen. But I think when you combine what I saw, at least, right, of people who are definitely 8 or 9 feet tall, you combine that with all the legends from around the world, I think is probably dead real that we did have people the size of Goliath walking the earth back then. And they just weren't 50-50 with the numbers of human population. It was just obviously lesser. Let's just say maybe they only represented 5 to 10% of the overall human population on the earth. So they would have been far less. They would have occurred far less in terms of like fossil remains. And also, if you had these the bigger you are, the more food you need. So a lot of giants and bigger people they would have had twice or three times the difficulty for obtaining natural resources and food and surviving thus in ancient times than the average sized human would. The smaller you are, the less food you need. You know what I mean? The big you are, you have more of a problem. So they would have to probably be more nomadic. So giants would either probably live in caves near the ocean where they could always get a recycling source of food, or if they lived on land, deeper in land, they probably have to be nomadic because they would eat up everything in their area. Even if they grew crops, I mean, their fields would have to be twice, three times as large, right? My point is they'd have to be nomadic. They'd probably be fighting each other for resources all the time. So that little 5 or 10% of the pop, their 5 or 10% of the human population would probably go downhill because they weren't. You would think that giants would be successful, right? Because they're bigger and they can oppose humans. But being successful isn't always about opposing things, it's about survivability, right? So just because you're bigger and stronger and more scary looking because of your size and strength doesn't mean that you're going to be more successful as an organism on the planet. So I think if a bitter cold comes, they could build big structures, right? But little humans would find it easier to go hide in little caves, right? And survive the bitter cold, like ancient cavemen did and all that, surviving the ice ages and whatnot that they had to go through. Big giants are huge. They can't really hide as well, right? Yeah, they can build big structures, right? But my point is it's harder for them to hide. They're also bigger targets for hungry animals, right? If you're 20 feet tall or 10 feet tall, it's harder for you to hide than a little person who can duck down in a bush if a group of bears or lions comes out, right? And if an elephant would see you, back in ancient times, they might view you as a threat because you're about as big as the elephants. So they might like gang up on the giants and try to kill them off. So we have to realize all these things, and that humans would probably value the giant remains as trophies. So if there was a giant in your village and he got defeated or died from old age or disease, the humans of that village would undoubtedly run out there, pickpocket all the bones and giant artifacts remains, and keep them for themselves. And then over time, they're just lost to history. That is what would happen. So the only remains of giants I think we should expect to find will be, probably 5 to 10% of the human remains of regular sized humans that we find. So I don't know how many human remains of normal sized humans that we normally find, right? The remains have to be preserved well. There's lots of different environmental conditions. Did they get scavenged by animals and their remains scattered? Did bacteria and different forms of rot decompose things too quickly? Did they get washed away and spread? Did a forest fire destroy the remains? There's all these things, natural elements that fight against a skeleton being preserved, right? So when you factor all this in, I think we shouldn't expect to find many remains of giants. And if you're a big, giant 1,000-pound person and you die, your body is going to be 10 times smellier than a normal sized person who drops down and dies. So every scavenging, foraging type creature in the vicinity is going to smell you, right? So if a giant dies, boom, every bear, tiger, mountain lion, raccoon, everything in the vicinity, all the crows, vultures, birds of prey, everything in the vicinity, the flies, everything are just going to smell it in a radius that's like 10 times greater than a normal human. Okay? Your carcass is going to be that much taller on the ground that the wind will pass the odor over far better than if you're just a little person and you fell down. The tall grass might mask your odor, but you're a big, giant, 10-foot tall plus person. You die. Nope. You're getting wafted around the whole valley, and every, carnivore that scavenges is just going to come for your meat as food. And then they're going to take your bones apart, eat the marrow, and then scatter the remains. And then over time, the elements will destroy all those remnants. Any humans that come by over the next 1,000 or whatever years, they're going to find these giant bones or a human skull that's massive, and they're going to think, "Oh, that's so cool," and they're going to take it and put it on their mantle and say, "Oh yeah, I killed this giant," or something stupid. That's what would happen. So we shouldn't really expect to find a lot of giant remains. Um, and one day we might. One day we might. And that's the thing. We should keep looking and we might find it. They have found, I will say, They have found human teeth that are twice as big as regular human teeth, and it was from something called Meganthropus. But because they don't have a complete skeleton, they don't know exactly what it looked like. But Meganthropus could have been between 7 even to 9 foot tall. Okay, and like when you look at their molar teeth, I can't remember exactly, but they're huge. They're like twice as big. Even Denisovians had teeth much larger. Denisovians had teeth much larger, but I think the science says the Denisovians, even though they might have been a bit bigger, maybe towards 7 feet or whatever, generally it's just that they were bulkier, like super bulky and uber built. You know what I mean? So they had big jaws and big teeth, but they weren't necessarily super tall, right? But Meganthropus was probably, based on the teeth, 7 to 9 feet tall. So there have arguably been physical remains found that could back it up. And on the flip mode, they did find remains of the hobbit species on, I think it was Flores or wherever it was. And those hobbits, like, what were they? They're under 4 feet, maybe between 2.5 to 3.5 feet tall. I can't remember for sure. And they were just legend before then. So again, the locals there had legends of short people like that. They had legends, just like every place, of tall people and short people. And we know that people with dwarfism exist today, and we know that tall people exist today, but it's like science doesn't want us to believe that there were giants, right? We don't have to have 40, 50, 100-foot tall giants walking around, but there are definitely Goliaths, right? There were definitely ones 9 foot tall, maybe even a little bit bigger. There's no reason to think that there wasn't. So anyways, that's my little fun story for today, folks. Take care. Thank you for coming by.